is the Lord's house. Everybody is welcome. This is the Lord's house. Everybody is welcome. This is the Lord's house. Everybody is welcome. Come on in and taste the bread of life.
Hey, good morning, Avon Church family. It's really great to be with you virtually this morning. I hope you're having a great time with your home groups for church at home. And this is also week 1 of Advent. And what better way to start Advent off than to talk about hope? Hope is so important during every season, but I feel like as we come out of the pandemic, hope is an important reminder for us that we can look for hope in lots of different places. Feeling hopeful or hopeless is a part of the human condition. It's what makes us human, right? Feeling hopeful or feeling immense hopelessness is as human as any other emotion, quality that makes us us. Right? Regardless of your income, your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, your geography, we all experience hope and hopelessness. Hope and hopelessness are as human as bread. Bread. There's some form of bread in every continent, every people group, everywhere. I mean, archaeologists are finding evidence that bread has been around a long time. And for thousands of years, at the very least, bread has been a symbol of hope and life and survival and care and community, family during difficult and hopeless situations. It might look different in certain parts of the world. I mean, we have sourdough, we have bao, we have paratha, focaccia, we have challah bread, we have hoe cakes, fougasse, we have soda bread and biscuits. There are so many different types, but it's all bread. And for many, many cultures, and really I think for us today, it is still a sign of hope. And now, I don't mean the grocery store bread that we see for $2 each. That I don't think we notice very often. But there's something really powerful about seeing bread being made, going to a bakery or a pastry shop, recognizing that bread is beautifully human. I mean, if we think about the biblical story, what did Jesus eat at the Last Supper with his closest friends? They had some bread. And when the Israelites, when they were fleeing Egypt and their captors, what did they make? They made bread that was unleavened. Bread is an integral part of what makes us human. And for many, many cultures, a simple piece of bread is a sign that there is hope amidst hopelessness. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said this to his closest friends. He talks about hope, he talks about bread, and it goes like this. He told his closest friends another parable. He said, the community of God is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into 60 pounds of flour until it worked its way through and the flour rose. The community of God is like yeast mixed by a woman into 60 pounds of flour until it rose. I really like this simple parable. It's ultra simple, but yet there's so much profound truth in a few simple words. Now, the parable talks about bread, but I actually think this parable acts and resembles bread as well. I mean, for any non-bakers out there, bread can be made with only 2 ingredients. You need a flour and you need a liquid. And that's it. You can have bread if you have enough knowledge, if you give it enough time. Bread can be formed. And one of the most beautiful things about bread is it can rise. There can be yeast even if you don't put it in the bread yourself. And I feel like that's what this parable is kind of doing. I mean, there's a few simple words here, and if we take those words and we add enough time of reflection and meditation and communal conversations, profound truth and wisdom will come out of it. This parable is small, and yet it is mighty, and it is full of information for us. So how does this story give us hope? It's a great question. It's a question that I've been wrestling through as I've looked at this parable, and I hope that the more I speak this morning and the more you discuss with your home group, that you will recognize that this parable is all about hope. Now let's talk about the parable. Okay, first of all, we need to recognize a cultural difference. This parable seems very harmless to us. And yet, for Jesus' original audience, this wasn't just creative or cutting edge. This was an offensive parable. This was offensive to them. They would have been turned off by this parable because it drastically pushed the boundaries of what they thought good theology was. They were offended by it, and I'm going to explain why they were offended, but I'd actually like us to pause for a second, to take a deep breath, to put ourselves in their shoes. You might think that this story it's a little bit ridiculous that someone would get offended by that, and that's fair. We're living 2,000 years later. But let's talk about what offends us. Okay, I have a really simple question for you to digest a little bit as we continue to talk about this parable. It's a very simple question, and it goes like this. As you're looking for hope in this season, do you have any assumptions about what God would or wouldn't do? It's a very simple question. And we might struggle at first to answer it, but maybe the question can be rephrased a little bit to help you understand what I mean. Have you ever thought something like this? God would never work through that person or that people group. There's no way God would ever do that. Or maybe the question can look like, God would never show up in my life in this certain way. That's never going to happen. God doesn't work that way. Or maybe God would never challenge me to do blank. God would never challenge me to do blank. Do we have assumptions about what we think God does? Do we get offended when someone suggests that maybe God works in different ways, or with different people, or with different situations or locations? What are our assumptions that we're bringing into this parable, just like the original audience? And my challenge for us today, and my challenge for myself as well, is that maybe, just maybe, when we're struggling to find hope, maybe hope is there, but we're allowing our assumptions to get in the way. Maybe hope is actually present and we're just not able to identify it because we're making our assumptions fill that space rather than noticing the hope that's present with us. That's the challenge this morning. But let's go back to the explanation of the parable. Okay, are you ready? The community of God is like yeast. Oh, Jesus, that is bad theology. God can never be described as yeast. That doesn't make sense to the original audience, and here's why. For the original audience, and I'm guessing most of them or all of them would have been Jewish, in that ancient culture, yeast was a symbol of things that are unholy. or things that are unclean. Yeast is a symbol of corruption. When the original audience would bake bread and give it to the priests at the temple, they would never put yeast in that bread. They would always make it unleavened. At the Passover dinner, where Jewish people remember all that God did for their ancestors in freeing them from Egypt, what do they eat together? They eat unleavened bread. Yeast is a symbol of corruption, things that are unholy, things that are unclean. And actually there's a really fascinating ritual that happens every year and has happened every year at Passover for thousands of years. I love it. It's fantastic. It's such an interesting thing that I wonder if we should include in our own modern spirituality, and it looks like this. Before the Passover festival starts, Jewish families, they go through their entire house and they look for everything that has yeast in it. Everything. Once they find it and they collect it all, they throw it in the garbage, they take it off their property, they remove everything with yeast in their house, because yeast is a sign of things that are unclean. But there's actually a bigger symbol here. Once they do that, they then want to try and get rid of the yeast that is in their hearts. Now, that might sound like a little bit of a weird phrase to us, but I think it kind of makes sense. It's a great symbol. If yeast causes flour to swell and to rise, then the yeast in our hearts are things that maybe make our ego swell. You know what I mean? Those things that are living in our hearts that feel corrupt and unclean, that give us a big ego, that cause us to swell up. And when our hearts are swollen, for Jewish people, they say, well, how are you going to notice God? How are you going to notice God when your heart is already filling up with ego and just bad stuff? And so you symbolically remind yourself by getting rid of all the yeast in your house, and then you work hard to get rid of the yeast in your heart. And then you can start celebrating Passover. Yeast. Yeast for the original audience was bad, and yet there's a lot of and yets in this parable. Jesus says, I know that you think yeast is bad, but God's community is like yeast. It's not bad, it's not unclean, but you need to start recognizing that God is bigger than our assumptions. God works differently than how we assume God must work. God's community is like yeast. All right, number 2. Who mixes the flour and the yeast? Did you notice that? Who mixes the flour and the yeast? And the answer is a woman. It's a woman, and in the ancient culture that the original audience would have been from, who are listening to this story, I'm sad to say it, but we all understand that this was the case, and unfortunately is still the case in many parts of the world. Women were second-rate citizens. In ancient cultures, women were given less status. They didn't have equal status, they had less status, and therefore they were marginalized members of society. And in some places, actually I'm going to say in more places than we would like to admit, that is still true today, that they are marginalized. And we can name other marginalized groups that are in the world. I don't need to name them. You are aware of the groups that are marginalized in our modern society. And that is the type of person that this parable is using to talk about the community of God. Because for the original audience, they would say, if God's community is going to exist on the earth, and more than exist, if we are going to accomplish great things, then who's going to be at the center of that? It's got to be a king. It has to be royalty, or it has to be a priest. Or it has to be someone famous and important, and someone who talks with dignitaries and intellectuals. It has to be in a special location, like a throne room or a university or a temple or somewhere important. An important person in the hierarchy that humans just horribly and naturally create, and it has to be in a location that feels important. That's the assumption. God's community is going to do great things if it's in a great location with a great person from human standards. And yet, here's another and yet. God challenges through Jesus this idea about God's activity and says actually the best way to describe the community of God is through a woman covered in the dust of flour all over her apron, baking in a kitchen. Not a throne room kitchen, not a 5-star restaurant kitchen, in a house with a simple stove and simple ingredients, with a simple person that has been overlooked by society. That's where God's activity is found. That's where hope is. A woman is at the center of this story. The community of God is found in the simple task of baking bread. Number 3. How much bread is being made? Did you catch that? How much bread is being made? This marginalized woman making bread unfit for the temple isn't making 1 or 2 loaves, or 4 or 5 loaves, or 6 loaves, or 10 loaves. Try 52 loaves, each weighing 1 pound each. And if you do the math on that, 52 loaves cut into a normal slice equals 832 slices of bread, ready to feed everyone. Ready to feed everyone. Jesus uses such a comically large amount of flour to represent the community of God, and Jesus is doing something really fun here. He's doing a throwback to a story in the Old Testament about hope. See, Abraham and Sarai were their names, and they were a couple that were following God. They were living a nomadic lifestyle, and they were feeling hopeless. Because God said, you're going to have a child, and they hadn't had one yet. They had been struggling for years to have a child, like so many of our families experience. And they're just wondering, where is God in this? I thought we were supposed to have a child. I want to have a child. I don't know what's going on, and so I'm feeling hopeless. And what does God do? God does something a little unexpected. God sends 3 unclean, foreign travelers to encourage them, to speak God's truth into their lives. And so these visitors, they are welcomed into the camp that Abraham and Sarai are living in. And what is their response? We are going to show them hospitality, and we are going to make them 52 loaves of bread, each weighing 1 pound each, or 832 slices of bread ready to feed them. We are going to show immense generosity and hospitality. So what's the message of such a comically large amount of flour in this parable? Well, I think this logic makes sense. If the woman was to make 1 or 2 loaves, that would probably be a selfish parable, because she's making it for herself. And if she was making 4 or 5 loaves, maybe that would be talking about caring for your family, because that's all that's going to feed. But if this woman is desiring to make 52 loaves of bread, 832 slices, then she must not be thinking about herself or about her family or about her neighbors or about her town. She is thinking about everyone. Everyone is invited to this table. Everyone is going to be cared for and nourished. Everyone is going to feel welcome and valued. She is going to show as much hospitality and generosity as she is able. And to do that, she needs 60 pounds of flour. And so we have this parable. The community of God is like a marginalized member of society, using unclean and unexpected ingredients to change the world. A marginalized member using unexpected ingredients to change the world. If we want to feel hope, if we want to be hope for our community, we need to remind ourselves that God works in unexpected ways, through unexpected people, in unexpected circumstances and situations, and unexpected locations. The audience thought they knew where to look for God's hope. They probably felt like they knew how God operated, how God worked. God works in these ways. And if those things aren't happening, then there's no hope to be found. I'm going to admit right now that that's how often what goes through my head. I'm pretty sure I know what God's up to. And if the situation doesn't check those boxes, then God must not be there. God only does things through A, B, or C, never the other options. When I think that way, number one, I think we're putting God in a box, and number two, I think we are missing out on so much hope in our lives, so much connection with unexpected people and unexpected places. But here, Jesus reminds his friends that God's community looks different. That God chooses to use unholy locations, marginalized people groups, and situations that anyone in their right mind would say, there's no way God is here. But God is. And if we really think about it, that's the message of Christmas. That's the message of Advent. Think about it. Israel is living under Roman control. And for the Jewish people, the situation is feeling hopeless. Hopeless. We can't even rule ourselves. We are under oppression and military control. Where is the hope here? And where are the people looking? Let's read between the lines a little bit. Where are the people looking for hope? Well, if you do some historic investigation, they were looking at the military. We're going to find hope if we can kick the Romans out. They were looking at the throne. If only we had a king, then we could be free. And they were looking at the temple. The assumed locations that God works. If God isn't working in the military, if God isn't working in the throne, if God isn't working in the temple, then God must not be here, and it's hopeless. If God shows up, if God is going to come into our lives, we better be watching the throne and the temple. And yet, there's another one for you. And yet, as everybody is looking at their assumed locations of God's presence, there's a small, helpless baby crying in a donkey stall next to sheep and goats and nursing from his mother. There's the hope. There's God. There is Emmanuel, which means God with us. It's so easy for us to make assumptions about where God is going to be present in our lives, where God is going to show up, with what people God is going to speak to us. And yet the Christmas message is saying, actually, God works a lot bigger than our imaginations do. When we're looking at the throne, God is in a donkey stall. God is in unexpected locations with unexpected people. And that's really what this parable is talking about. It can be so easy in our busy lives to really view the world like 60 pounds of flour. The assumption there's no activity there. It's just so heavy and so white and just it's powder. There's nothing of substance there. And then, given enough time, the yeast slowly starts to bubble up and starts to appear and starts to uncover itself, and there's activity and there's motion and there's rising flour and expansion and bubbles and excitement, and then you get bread. It's so easy to view the world like that 60 pounds of flour and say, the only way that I can experience hope is if God does A, B, or C. I'm going to look to where I assume God is going to be, and maybe, just maybe, God is present in other places. Maybe God's present in a factory on Sundays. Maybe there's a people group in Stratford that you have assumptions about, and God is there. Maybe there's a situation or something you're feeling challenged to do that you think there's no way God is present there. Maybe God is there. The Christmas message is that when all eyes were pointed on the throne, God was in a helpless baby. The community of God is like yeast that a woman mixed into 60 pounds of flour to change the world. The community of God is like a marginalized member of society, using unclean and unexpected ingredients to change everything. To invite everyone to the table, to include everyone, to nourish everybody. So if you're looking for hope, if you want to be hope in this season, then let's expand our assumptions about where God is working and what God might be doing, and let's hop on that train with God. Because the community of God looks a little bit different. On the night that Jesus was about to be betrayed, he had a dinner party with his closest friends. And taking some focaccia, he broke it. And he said, "This is my body. Do this in remembrance of me." And later in the meal, he grabbed a cup. And he lifted it. He said, "This is my blood, spilled out for you, through love and for hope. Every time you eat this bread and you drink this cup, remember me."
This is the Lord's house. Everybody is welcome. This is the Lord's house. Everybody is welcome. This is the Lord's house. Everybody is welcome. Come on in.